Lightning cracked over the Ashwater River just as John Dawson's ferry rope snapped taut in his hands, and the current tried to tear the whole barge sideways into the flood. He dug his boots against the wet planking and hauled, muscles screaming, rain needling into his eyes so hard he could barely see the far landing anymore. The river had risen 2 feet since sundown, brown and furious, dragging branches and drowned deer past the hull. He should have tied up an hour ago. He should have listened to the sky when it first turned the color of a bruise. But he had seen her from across the water, slumped against the sentinel post on the Orc side of the crossing, not moving, and once he had seen that, there had been no version of the night where he simply went home. "Come on," he growled at the rope, at the river, at himself, and heaved the ferry the last few yards until the hull scraped Orc-side gravel. He half fell off the barge, boots sliding in the mud, and staggered up the bank toward the shape huddled at the base of the old stone post that marked the treaty line. Rain sheeted down in gray curtains, and thunder rolled through the deep forest behind her like something enormous turning over in its sleep. Vragesh. She lifted her head at the sound of her name, slow, like it cost her. Vragesh Rageborn, sentinel of the Rageborn clan, the woman both sides of that river called fearless in the same breath they called her dangerous, was on her knees in the mud with one hand pressed hard against her side. Blood had soaked through the leather there, diluted pink by the storm, spreading down over the fitted brown-green leathers that clung to her powerful frame, the vambraces on her forearms slick and dark, her black hair plastered to her jaw in ropes. Her tusks caught what little light there was, and her yellow eyes, usually so full of contempt for weakness, were glassy with cold and blood loss. "Go back," she rasped. "This is not your post, ferryman. You're bleeding. I am aware." She tried to push herself up on the post and failed, teeth clenching around a sound she refused to let become a groan. "A raiding party came at my hunters 3 days past. The wound reopened tonight. It is nothing." "It's not nothing, you're freezing." He was already shrugging out of his coat, the one good coat he owned, oiled wool gone dark with rain, the only thing standing between him and the cold once he had to cross that river again. He didn't think about that part. He thought about the gray tinge under her green skin and the way her hands had begun to shake. "Here." He held it out to her, dripping, useless-looking in the deluge, and for a moment she only stared at it like he'd offered her an insult. "You would freeze," she said. "I've got a fire waiting on the other side. You don't. I am a sentinel of the Rageborn clan. I do not need the coat off a human's back." "Fine," John said, and knelt anyway, right there in the mud in front of her, close enough that he could feel the heat bleeding out of her in the cold air, could see how hard she was fighting to keep her spine straight against that post. "Then don't need it. Just take it." Something in her face cracked, just slightly, at the stubbornness in his voice, at a human man on his knees in a flood offering her the only warmth he had. She looked at him for a long moment through the rain, her jaw tight, and then she reached out, not for the coat exactly, but for him, one strong hand closing around his forearm with a grip that could have broken bone, and pulled. He went down beside her hard, breath knocked half out of him, and before he could say a word she had dragged the coat open over both their shoulders and pulled him in against her side, under the wool, under the shelter of her own body curled protectively half around his smaller frame. "Vragesh." "Be still, ferryman." Her voice was rough and closer now, her breath warm against his temple in a way that made his heart slam against his ribs harder than the flood ever had. "You give away your only coat and think I will let you sit outside it in the cold like a fool. No, this is how it will be done. We share, or we do not do it at all." He went still. The storm howled around the treaty post, thunder rolling through the black trees of the deep forest at her back, and under one soaked coat, pressed shoulder to shoulder with an Orc Sentinel who could have snapped him in half with one hand and had instead pulled him close enough to keep him warm, John Dawson felt something shift loose in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. "You're hurt," he said quietly, because it was easier than saying anything else. "I have been hurt before. Not like this. Not out here alone. She was quiet for a moment, her side rising and falling against his with each careful breath. I was not going to leave my post, not with the truce already so thin. If I abandon this crossing during a storm, there are those on both sides who will say the Rageborn clan cannot be trusted to hold a line. Nobody's going to think that of you. You would be surprised, ferryman, what men will say about an orc when it suits their purposes. Her voice had an edge to it, old and tired, and he understood then that she had been carrying more than a wound tonight. There have been raids, against my hunters, twice now. Someone wishes this truce broken, and I do not yet know who. I didn't hear about any raids. You would not. Humans do not tell their ferryman everything that crosses his river. She shifted, and a hiss of pain slipped through her teeth despite herself. John's hand found her side almost without his permission, pressing gently over the wound through the sodden leather, and she let him, which surprised them both. "I've got bandage cloth on the barge," he said, "and whiskey if you'll take orc medicine from a human bottle. I will take anything that stops this feeling of the world tilting, a ghost of dry humor in it even now. You are a strange man, John Dawson." "How do you mean?" Any other ferryman on this river would have stayed on his own bank tonight and let the storm take whatever it wished from the orc side. She turned her head just slightly, so her eyes found his in the dark, gold catching what lightning there was. "You crossed a flooding river for a sentinel who has done nothing for you but check your cargo and turn away your traders when their manifests lied." "You've never once been unfair to me," John said. "That's more than I can say for half the men in Belhaven." Her gaze held his a moment longer than was comfortable, longer than either of them could explain later, and then she looked away, out at the black water, and did not answer. But she did not pull the coat away either. They sat like that until the worst of the storm passed, her body a wall of heat against the cold, his shoulder aching pleasantly where it pressed to hers, both of them saying nothing more, because there was nothing safe left to say. By the time the rain thinned to a drizzle and gray dawn began to bruise the eastern sky, John had bound her wound with strips torn from his own shirt, and Vragesh Rageborn had let a human man tend her like it was the most natural thing in the world, though she would not, even now, admit why she had let him close enough to try. They did not speak of the coat again that morning. She rose on her own strength, waved off his offered hand, and told him gruffly to get his ferry home before the current took it. But when he looked back from the water, she was still watching him, one hand pressed to her bandaged side, and something in the set of her mouth was no longer quite so hard as it had been the night before. For 3 weeks after the storm, the crossing at Belhaven Ford ran the same as it always had, at least on the surface. John pulled his barge back and forth across the ashwater, carrying grain sacks and bolts of cloth from the human side, furs and carved antler and jars of forest honey from the orc side, collecting his coppers, nodding to the customs officer at the human landing and to the sentinel at the orc landing, same as he had for the better part of 6 years since the truce had been signed. Except now, every time he reached the far bank, Vragesh Rageborn was watching for him before his hull ever touched the gravel, and every time he pushed off for home, she watched until the current carried him out of sight. "You are late," she told him one gray morning, arms crossed over the fitted leather that hugged her broad shoulders and narrow waist, tusks catching the pale light. "The grain barge from Millhillow crossed an hour past. Had a wheel come off the cart on my end, nothing to worry over." I was not worried. She said it too quickly, and he let himself smile at that, small and private, the kind of smile he hadn't worn much before that storm. "How's the side?" "Healed." She rolled her shoulder to prove it, though he saw the small hitch in the motion that told him it was not entirely true yet. "You fuss like an old woman, ferryman. Somebody's got to." It became a rhythm between them, this trading of barbs across his cargo manifests, and underneath the barbs, something else grew, quiet and unacknowledged, a warmth that neither of them named because naming it would have made it real, and real was dangerous for a human man and an orc sentinel standing on either side of a line that had cost a war to draw. The trouble came on a market morning, 3 weeks after the storm, when a trader named Bartle Fenn spat at Vrogesh's boots in front of half of Belhaven and called her a beast dressed up in leather. John had been unloading barrels when he heard the commotion, and by the time he reached the landing, a crowd of a dozen townsfolk had gathered around Vrogesh where she stood inspecting a wagon's manifest, Fenn red-faced and shouting that orcs had no business handling honest human goods, that the truce was a leash on decent folk, that someone ought to remind the greenskins where they belonged. Vrogesh did not raise a hand against him. She stood very still, jaw tight, eyes flat and dangerous in a way John had never seen turned on him, and said nothing at all, which was somehow worse than if she had shouted back, because John understood in that moment how many times she must have swallowed exactly this and called it duty. He set down the barrel he was carrying and walked straight into the middle of it. Fenn. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the crowd's murmur clean enough that heads turned. You've got a manifest to file same as everyone else. Get in line or get gone. Dawson, you take her side over your own kind. I'll take the side of anybody doing their job without spitting on folks who haven't done a thing to earn it. He stepped between Fenn and Vrogesh, close enough that he felt the heat of her at his back, close enough that if Fenn had swung, he'd have swung at John first. She's checked every wagon that's crossed this ford for 6 years without a single complaint filed against her. That's more than I can say for you and your scales, which came up short on the miller's grain twice last season. That took the wind out of Fenn considerably, and the crowd's murmur shifted, a few laughs at the trader's expense, and Fenn slunk off muttering with his wagon, leaving the landing quiet again. Vrogesh did not thank him in front of the crowd. She waited until the last of the onlookers had drifted back to their stalls, and then she caught his sleeve before he could return to his barrels, her grip firm, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. You did not need to do that, she said low. I know. You made an enemy of Fenn for a woman who is not even of your kind. Vrogesh. He said her name the way he'd started saying it since the storm, careful, like it meant something. You're not just some woman who isn't of my kind. I don't know what you are to me exactly. But it's not nothing, and I'm done pretending it is just to keep men like Fenn comfortable. Her hand tightened on his sleeve, and for one long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, the river sliding past behind them, the market noise a distant hum, her golden eyes locked on his mouth like she was fighting a war inside herself that he could see written plain on her face. Then she kissed him. It was not gentle. It was the kiss of a warrior who had decided something and would not be argued out of it. One hand fisting in the front of his shirt to drag him up onto his toes, her mouth hot and fierce against his. Tusks a careful danger she navigated without ever breaking the kiss. And John's hands came up to her waist, because he had wanted this since a stormy night 3 weeks past, and had not let himself believe he was allowed to want it. When she finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard, and a slow, startled grin was spreading across her face like she'd surprised herself as much as him. Well, she said, that is done. Vrogesh rageborn, John said, a little dazed. You don't do anything by halves, do you? No, she agreed. I do not. They did not have long to enjoy it. 10 days after that kiss, a rageborn hunting party was ambushed in the deep forest a half-day's walk from the crossing, 3 orcs wounded, 1 dead, and the raiders had left behind human-forged arrowheads that could not be mistaken for anything else. The truce, 6 years unbroken, cracked down its whole length in a single night. John heard about it from Vrogesh herself, standing rigid at the orc landing the next morning, her face carved from stone, her voice flat with the effort of holding back a fury that would otherwise have leveled the ford. His name was Draka, she said. He had 3 seasons left before he would have taken a mate of his own choosing. Now he is ash on a rageborn pyre, and my father wants to march every warrior we have across this river by the week's end. Vrogesh, I had no part in this. I know that. Her hand found his, quick and hard, a rare public admission of what they had become to each other. But my father does not know you as I do. To him, you are simply another human, and every human on that bank is suspect now. That same week, John began noticing things he could not unsee. Captain Silas Crane, commander of the Belhaven garrison, had been crossing the ford at strange hours, always at night, always with a small party of soldiers who carried no manifest and gave no names. John, poling them across in silence because a ferryman did not question armed men in the dark, had caught sight once of an arrowhead loose in a soldier's pack, the same distinctive forge mark he had later heard described as the one found in Draka's body. He told Vragesh that same night at her post, voice low even though there was no one to overhear. Crane's men have been crossing after dark. I saw an arrowhead in one soldier's kit that matched what you described. I can't swear to it in front of a magistrate, but I know what I saw. Her eyes went hard and bright, the fury of a woman who finally had a name to put to her hatred. Crane wants this forest. Everyone on this border knows it. The timber alone would make him rich, and a war would give him the excuse to take it under a soldier's authority instead of a settler's plow. She looked at John for a long moment. If you say this where the wrong ears hear it, they will call you a liar, or worse, a traitor who has been turned soft by an orc's bed. Do you understand what that means for you? I understand it means I need proof before I open my mouth. It means more than that. Her jaw worked. It means that if my father learns a human ferryman has been standing this close to me, kissing me on a public landing, he will not see a man in love. He will see a weakness in his own daughter that the humans might exploit, and he will demand you be dealt with, one way or another, before this war swallows us both. John felt the ground shift under that in a way the storm had never managed. Then what do we do? Vragesh was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the black water, her hand still wrapped around his. There is a way, she said finally, to place you beyond my father's reach and beyond Crane's both at once. It is not gentle and it is not undone once it is done. It is a claiming. That night, torches burned along the Orc landing in defiance of the dark, driven into the mud in a rough circle, hide tents rising in shadowed rows behind them where the rage-born war camp sprawled back into the trees. Word had gone ahead of them, carried by runners, and by the time John crossed the ford at Vragesh's side, half the clan had gathered to see what their sentinel intended. Chief Goreth Rageborn stood before his own great tent, arms like felled trunks crossed over a chest scarred by 3 decades of border wars, his tusks longer and yellower than his daughter's, his eyes just as sharp. He looked at John Dawson the way a man looks at a stray dog that has wandered somewhere it should not be. This is the human, he said, not a question. This is John Dawson, Vragesh said, standing straight and unflinching before her own father in a way that told John exactly how much courage this was costing her, and I claim him as mine before this clan tonight. A murmur went through the gathered orcs, low and dangerous. Among them John saw a broad warrior named Throg Ironjaw shove forward, tusks bared, eyes blazing. You would claim a river rat over your own kind, Throg spat. I have asked for you 3 seasons running, Vragesh Rageborn, and you refuse every time, only to hand yourself to a human who cannot even lift a war axe. I do not answer to you, Throg. Her voice cracked like a whip. And I do not claim him because he can lift an axe. I claim him because he crossed a flooding river to bring me warmth when he had nothing else to give, and because Captain Crane means to use this man's death, or mine, or both, to drag this whole border into a war that will kill hundreds who have done nothing but try to live along this line in peace. If he is mine, by clan law, no human court may touch him as a traitor, and no clan hand may touch him as a spy. It is the only shield strong enough to hold over both our heads until the truth of these raids is dragged into the light. Goreth's eyes moved from his daughter to John, weighing something old and complicated behind them. You understand what she offers you, ferryman. A claiming mark cannot be undone. It binds you to her and her to you before every clan that reads the sign of it. If you take this and do not mean it, I will see to your death myself. John looked at Vragesh, at the fierce, frightened hope barely hidden beneath her warrior's stillness, and found there was no hesitation left in him at all. I mean it, he said. I've meant it since a storm 3 weeks past, Chief Gorath. I'm not doing this only to save my own skin. Gorath studied him a long moment, then gave a single, heavy nod and stepped back. Vragesh took John's hand and drew him to the center of the torchlit circle. The clan pressed close around them, torches guttering in a night wind that smelled of pine and wood smoke, and John felt every eye in that camp on him, human and small among giants, and yet he had never in his life felt more certain of where he was meant to stand. "This will hurt," Vragesh murmured only for him, her hand cradling the side of his throat, her thumb tracing the pulse there with a gentleness that contrasted violently with what she was about to do. "I am sorry for that. I trust you." Her eyes flickered, something raw and stunned passing through them at those 3 words, and then she leaned in and set her teeth against the joint of his neck and shoulder, and bit down. Pain flared white and sharp through him, and John's hands found her waist and held on, grounding himself against her rather than pulling away. And around them, the clan let out a low, rolling sound of approval, a chant in the old tongue that he did not understand but felt in his chest like the beat of a war drum. When she drew back, blood welled dark at the mark on his skin, already knitting strange and swift beneath her tongue where she pressed a final, lingering kiss to seal it, and the torchlight caught her face, fierce and possessive, and beneath all that fire, achingly relieved. "It is done," she said to the clan and to him both. "He is mine. Let any who challenge that come to me directly." No one did. They lived in the weeks that followed in a strange half-place between the 2 banks of the Ashwater, John still crossing daily to run his ferry, Vragesh still holding her post at the Orc landing, both of them bearing a bond that was legal and permanent, and yet, between the 2 of them in private, oddly unspoken. They did not share a bed those first weeks. They shared meals at the edge of the camp, sat together on the riverbank in the evenings while she cleaned her blade and he mended his ropes, and every so often his hand would find hers or hers his, and they would sit like that in silence until the stars came out, both too careful, too aware of all that had been done in haste to reach for more than that. "You have not asked me if I regret it," Vragesh said one evening, watching the current. "I figured you'd tell me if you did. I do not." She turned her head, gold eyes steady on his face. "I have not regretted a single moment since that storm, John Dawson. I am only afraid that you claimed a life bound to mine before you had the chance to want it freely, and that frightens me more than any raid." "Vragesh." He reached over and took her hand properly this time, laced his fingers through hers, calloused palm to calloused palm. "I've wanted this since you pulled me under that coat. The claiming just made it official faster than either of us planned. That doesn't make it less true." Her fingers tightened around his, and for the first time since the torches and the blood, she smiled at him the way she had on the market landing after that first kiss, unguarded and a little disbelieving of her own good fortune. It was at the next market day that everything nearly came apart. Belhaven Square was crowded that morning, wagons lined 3 deep along the main road, farmers and traders from both banks haggling over furs and grain under a bright, deceptively peaceful sky. John had brought a load of Rageborn honey and carved antler goods across for a trading post run by a woman named Marta Voss, and Vragesh had crossed with him, a rare public showing on the human side, drawing stares she bore with her chin high, one hand never far from his. It was Captain Silas Crane who found them there, flanked by a half-dozen of his garrison soldiers, his eyes sharp and calculating as he studied the pair of them across the crowded square. "Dawson," Crane's voice carried deliberately over the market noise. "There's a rumor going round that our ferryman has taken up rather closely with the border's favorite sentinel. I confess I did not credit it until now. Whatever business is between me and Vragesh Rageborn is my own, Captain. Is it?" Crane's gaze slid to Vragesh, cold and assessing, the look of a man calculating how a piece might be moved on a board. "Strange thing, Orc customs. I've read a little in my years commanding this border. A claiming mark, they call it. Quite distinctive, I'm told. Left at the throat or the shoulder. John felt Vragesh go very still beside him, felt her hand tighten on his, but it was too late. A gust of wind off the river caught the loose collar of his shirt, and Crane's eyes fixed on the raised, dark scar at the joint of his neck, with the satisfaction of a man who has just found exactly what he was hunting for. "There it is," Crane said, and raised his voice deliberately now, pitched to carry across the whole crowded square. "Good people of Belhaven, behold your ferryman, marked and claimed like livestock by an orc beast, and ask yourselves what other secrets he has carried across our river while wearing her collar beneath his shirt. How many raids has he warned them of? How many of our own soldiers has he ferried across to their deaths on her word?" The square erupted. Faces John had known for years, traders he had shared drinks with, farmers whose grain he had carried 1,000 times, turned on him in the space of a breath, shouting, some reaching for cudgels and pitchforks off nearby wagons, the old fear of the war years surging up raw and ugly beneath Crane's carefully chosen words. "That's not true," John shouted, but his voice was lost in the roar, and someone shoved him hard from behind, sending him stumbling into a wagon wheel. Vragesh moved between one heartbeat and the next, putting her body squarely in front of his, her hand closing around the hilt of the long knife at her belt without drawing it, her voice a battlefield roar that cut through the mob like a blade through cloth. "The next hand raised against this man answers to me." The crowd faltered. 20 feet of shoving, red-faced townsfolk suddenly reminded exactly what an angry, rage-born sentinel standing her ground looked like. Tusks bared, eyes blazing, every line of her body promising violence to anyone foolish enough to test her. "Stand down, Sentinel," Crane called out, cool and satisfied, clearly having expected exactly this. "Threaten free citizens on human soil, and you hand me every justification I need to march soldiers across that river tonight." "Then perhaps," said a new voice, cutting through the tension, "you should explain, Captain, why one of your own soldiers carries a rage-born forged blade taken from a hunter 3 days dead." Reeve Corwin Hale, magistrate of Belhaven, pushed through the crowd with 2 of his own town guard, his weathered face set hard. Behind him came John Dawson's own testimony finally given weight, because in his other hand he held a small, curved orc dagger, unmistakable rage-born craftsmanship, that he'd had one of his men quietly lift from a soldier's kit that very morning on a tip John had passed him 3 nights before, when he'd finally decided proof mattered more than his own safety. "Where did you get that?" Crane's composure cracked for the first time. "From your man Osric, who has been remarkably talkative since he realized the noose fits a captain's neck same as a common thief's." Hale's eyes swept the crowd. "Seems Captain Crane has been staging raids against rage-born hunters using stolen orc weapons, hoping to provoke exactly the war we are all standing in the middle of right now. The ferryman's testimony, given to me 3 nights past regarding your men's strange night crossings, is what set me looking in the first place." The square went deadly quiet. Crane's soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, hands loosening on their weapons, the mob's fury draining away into confused murmurs as the shape of the truth settled over them. "Seize him," Hale ordered, and this time it was Crane's own soldiers who stepped forward to disarm their captain, no longer willing to burn for a man who had lied to start a war for his own gain. Crane's mask of calm finally broke. "You would take the word of a beast-loving traitor over your own commander. I'd take proof over a grudge, Captain, same as any honest man." Hale's voice was final. He turned to Vragesh and inclined his head, an old soldier's respect, however grudging. "Sentinel Rageborn, I regret the shame this square has shown you and your mate today. It will be answered for." Vragesh did not lower her guard until Crane had been fully bound and marched away under guard, and only then did she turn to John, her hands finding his face, checking him over with a rough urgency that betrayed exactly how frightened she had been beneath her fury. "You gave the magistrate proof 3 nights ago," she said. "You never told me. I didn't want you crossing that river into danger if it went wrong. I wanted to be sure first." He covered her hands with his own. I told you I wasn't just going to sit and hope the raids stopped on their own. I meant that too." Her gold eyes searched his face, and whatever war had still been quietly waging in her heart since the night of the claiming seemed, in that moment, to finally lay down its arms. "I love you," she said, plain and fierce, right there in the square with half of Belhaven still watching. "I have loved you since a stormy night at the treaty post, and I was too proud of my own strength to say it until a man half my size stood between me and a mob to prove he had already chosen me back." John felt something in his chest crack wide open, warm and aching and full. "I love you too, Vragesh Rageborn. I think I have since you pulled me under that coat and told me we'd share it or not do it at all." She kissed him then in front of the whole shaken, watching square, and this time no one shouted, no one reached for a cudgel, and somewhere in the crowd, Reeve Hale allowed himself a small, tired smile. Word of Crane's treachery and the false raids meant to drag two peoples back into a war neither wanted, spread up and down the Ashwater within days. Chief Gorath Rageborn himself crossed the ford under a flag of truce to meet with Reeve Hale on neutral ground at the landing. The first time a Rageborn chief had set foot on human soil since the original treaty was signed 6 years before, and the two of them stood together over the dead fire of Crane's ambition and rebuilt, plank by careful plank, what had nearly been burned to the ground. Gorath's eyes found his daughter and the human ferryman standing hand in hand at the edge of that gathering, and something in the old chief's stern face softened, just slightly, at the sight. "You were right to claim him quickly," he told Vragesh later, gruff, when the humans had gone. "I did not think it wisdom at the time. I see now it may have saved more than his life." "It saved something in me too, father," Vragesh said, "though I doubt you wish to hear a warrior speak so softly." "I wish," Gorath said, "to see my daughter happy and alive and not raging alone at a border post in a storm. That will do for an old chief who has buried too many of his own to friendly fire and worse." That night the truce restored and Crane awaiting judgment in a Belhaven cell, John and Vragesh walked the riverbank together beneath a sky finally clear of storm clouds, stars scattered thick and bright over the black water. "I still have your coat," Vragesh said, unexpectedly. "The one from that night. I wondered where it got to. I kept it. I told myself it was practical that a sentinel should have a spare against the weather." She stopped walking, turned to face him fully, moonlight silvering the strong lines of her face, her hand coming up to rest over the claiming mark at his throat, gentle now where it had once been fierce. "It was not practical. I kept it because it smelled of you, and I was not yet brave enough to admit I wanted that comfort every night, not only during storms." John reached up and covered her hand with his own. "You don't have to keep wanting it in secret anymore." "No," she agreed, low and warm. "I do not." She kissed him then, slow this time. None of the fierce urgency of the market square or the desperate heat of that first kiss weeks before, but something deeper, unhurried, both of them finally free to want each other without a claiming's urgency or a mob's danger forcing their hand. His hand slid into her hair, hers found the front of his shirt, and when they finally drew back for breath, her forehead rested against his, both of them smiling in the dark like two people who had fought a long war just to reach this quiet, ordinary moment of simply being allowed to love each other. "Come home with me tonight," she murmured against his mouth. "Not to the camp. Not to your ferryman's cabin either. There is a place along this bank, halfway between both, that is neither Rageborn land nor Belhaven's. I have had my eye on it since before I ever let myself hope I might share it with someone." "Show me," John said, and she took his hand and led him along the moonlit water to a stretch of high ground overlooking the ford, where an old stone foundation from some long-abandoned watch post still stood half-buried in wild grass, close enough to hear the river always, close enough to see both banks at once. There beneath the stars, with the Ashwater singing quietly below and the deep forest breathing dark and vast at their backs, Vragesh Rageborn finally let down every last guard she had carried since that storm, and John Dawson finally stopped being the quiet, overlooked ferryman that half of Belhaven had never fully seen, and became instead exactly what he had been to her from the very first night she pulled him under her shelter. Chosen, wanted, needed, hers. What passed between them that night on the riverbank was tender and slow and utterly unhurried. Two people who had spent a season denying themselves, finally allowed to reach for each other without fear of mobs or chiefs or captains standing between them. And when dawn came pale and gold over the treaty line, they woke tangled together beneath that same old storm coat, spread now not for shelter from danger, but simply because neither of them wanted to be parted from it, or from each other, ever again. A season passed, autumn gold turning the deep forest along the ashwater to fire and rust, and the stone foundation on the high ground above the ford had become something else entirely. A proper timber home, half built by John's own hands and half by Vragesh's considerable strength, with a good stone hearth and shuttered windows that looked out over both banks of the river she still guarded, and he still crossed every single day. Trade had returned to Belhaven Ford in full, human wagons and rage-born traders moving easily across John's barge again, the old fear worn thin by 6 more months of unbroken peace, and by the sight, now common enough that no one remarked on it anymore, of the ferryman and the sentinel walking the market square together, her hand often resting easily at the small of his back, his fingers laced with hers whenever the crowd allowed it. Reeve Hale had seen Crane sent off in chains to answer to the Crown's justice further south. Chief Gorath had grown, if not warm, then at least steadily less suspicious of humans in general and openly fond of the particular one his daughter had claimed. Throg Ironjaw had, with considerable grumbling, taken a mate of his own from a neighboring clan the following summer, and had even, grudgingly, brought John a well-made hunting knife as something between an apology and a peace offering. On an evening in early autumn, rain began to fall soft and steady over the ashwater, nothing like the violent storm of a season past, just a gentle gray curtain drifting down over the water while smoke curled from the chimney of the home on the high ground. John stood in the open doorway watching it fall, the old storm coat, mended and re-oiled, hanging on its peg by the door where it had lived since the day they moved in together. Vragesh came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his middle, resting her chin against his shoulder, her claiming mark answering echo against the one she wore at her own throat, the twin scar she had insisted on taking from him in turn once the danger had passed, because, she told him fiercely, a bond should never run only one direction. "It is only rain," she said against his ear. "No storm tonight. I know." He turned in her arms to face her, the woman who had chosen him first with fear in her heart and now chose him every single day with none left at all. "Doesn't mean I don't want to share a coat with you anyway." She laughed, low and warm, and reached past him to pull the old coat down off its peg, and together they stepped out onto the small covered porch he had built that summer, and she settled it over both their shoulders exactly as she had that first night at the treaty post, pulling him in against her side beneath the shelter of the wool and her own steady warmth. "We share," she murmured, echoing words spoken a year before in mud and blood and lightning, "or we do not do it at all." "I wouldn't have it any other way," John said, and beneath the gentle rain, in the home they had built between two banks that no longer needed a war to divide them, Vragesh Rageborn and John Dawson stood wrapped together in one coat, exactly where they had always, from that very first storm, belonged.